I'm really pleased to be able to come and talk to you today about Green Deal. It's an unusual policy in many ways in that we haven't yet cleared primary legislation, but we're looking forward to delivery next October, but I'll come on to the timetable. So it's hugely ambitious. I am proud that in relation to the issue you raised on CERT, we have tried to increase the amount of professionally installed insulation under CERT. CERT is still a big part of my day job and is proving to be a stretching target, but happy to take comments on that as well as Green Deal. Okay, so what is Green Deal and why are we doing it? I'm going to talk about Green Deal, but I'm also going to talk about a few things that are very much intrinsic to Green Deal, including the business models that we think may be workable, and something called the energy company obligation, which follows on from CERT effectively. I'm going to start with why. Why are we doing Green Deal? Why now? There are lots of reasons put forward for doing Green Deal: energy security, home improvement, cutting the cost of energy bills for consumers. The reason I'm employed is fundamentally, though, to cut carbon emissions, and that lies at the heart of my interest and really shapes the ambition on programmes like Green Deal. This very basic chart shows that over the period 2008 to 2020, we're looking for a sort of 29% reduction, 24 megatons of carbon reduced. It says non-traded household emissions, so basically gas rather than electricity, which is catered for elsewhere. So what will Green Deal do? Well, it will contribute to that in the household sector. Other things will be in play. Smart meters will be around. There will be energy efficiency improvements through new boilers and other schemes. But the long-term vision is that the whole sector will reduce considerably by 2050. We will go from a period of lots of energy efficiency improvement to one where we move to different generation methods and microgen. And I'll come back to the longer-term vision, but sometimes it's easier to see where we're going in terms of a 2050 vision as much as a 2021. Okay, a bit of science now. Every sector, whether it's transport, industry, households, business premises, needs to cut carbon for us to meet very ambitious carbon budgets. In terms of the household sector, this shows some of the things that can be done. This is what is technically called a marginal abatement cost curve. It essentially says that if we move to the right, we can cut the amount of carbon, megatons of carbon dioxide, that are emitted. At the left-hand side are the most cost-effective ways of doing that. So, smart meters, very cost-effective because it's a relatively cheap installation, has a relatively modest cost saving in terms of energy efficiency because it still relies on behaviour. And then you've got issues that we've been doing for years under CERT: cavity wall insulation, loft insulation. But that big chunk in the middle with my yellow banner suggests where we need to move. We need to move into solid wall insulation if we're to keep moving across this map curve. And that's one of the big messages I like to leave you with today, is that we are, even though there's millions yet to be done on loft and cavity wall, we are coming to the end of those in the next 5-10 years' time. The technology that is emerging as the one that we need to move into, and there are some 8 million homes and further businesses with solid wall, is solid wall insulation, both internal and external. You'll see that renewables is further right, and in terms of that 2050 vision, although there are clearly schemes now to support renewables, to build up the sector so that we don't start from a cold start, the really big period for those sectors will be later, towards 2050, when we have a more decarbonised electricity network. Okay, so how does Green Deal work? Essentially, Green Deal is just a market framework. We want it to be as open as possible. What underpins it is something that has always existed. We're not telling anyone anything new. We're just creating a framework in which it's articulated. It has always been the case that energy efficiency measures save money, and that money, in theory, pays for the cost of you doing those measures. So with loft and cavity wall, that could pay for itself in a couple of years. Now we're getting onto the bigger measures like solid wall. You introduce much higher cost of installation and also a time period issue. If people can install something and feel confident they'll get a payback in the time that they're in that premise or that property, there's more incentive to do it. We're getting into time periods now with bigger measures where it's quite likely they'll want to move house, and if they invest just out of their own pocket in some of these technologies, they won't have recouped all of the costs of doing that through savings. So what the Green Deal does fundamentally is attach that saving to the energy meter of the property. Electricity is likely to be the meter chosen. It essentially says you can install at no upfront cost and have a payback over time, paid on the meter, and that payback stays with the measure at the property. So whoever moves in and out picks that up. This is a relatively basic, and clearly the figures are illustrative only, so please don't challenge me on gas price rises. What we're suggesting here is that a household that had on the left-hand side £800 bill for its energy consumption, annual bill that would be, with Green Deal measures could see that energy costs come down to 430. But on top of that, they would then get the charge to repay for those measures. So they get them upfront, no cost, the measures are done, they then start paying a charge, and that could be, in this example, 340 a year. The interesting point to note is what we're striving for is that the two sections on the right-hand side should never exceed the one on the left-hand side. That's not guaranteed because all manner of things can happen, including people increasing their energy consumption in ways that were not anticipated. But I'll come on to some ways in which we're trying to speak to the householder or the business about that proposition. The savings that we estimate will be typical savings. They'll be estimated from SAP. There'll be a code of practice for assessors in terms of what they advise people and installers, and I'll come back to some of that. Okay, so that is the basic concept of the golden rule. There are a couple of main areas where the golden rule doesn't work, but where we still want to see progress, because if we don't see progress, it's either unfair or we're not making progress towards our carbon targets. The main one in terms of underheating is the underheating pour. This is not underheating by choice, it's underheating because there is not enough money to heat the house to a sufficient level. If those households are underheating, these energy efficiency saving measures will not create sufficient saving to repay the cost of installation. And in those cases, we think some level of subsidy for upfront installation will be needed. The reason I stress underheating pour is that clearly lots of people also choose to underheat. That is a choice that we'll discuss with them in considering the Green Deal, and I'll come back to that on the assessment. The other big area is solid wall insulation. Solid wall is a measure that does pay for itself, but it doesn't pay for itself quickly enough for the finance terms that we're discussing with the finance community. At the maximum, they want finance products for about 25 years. Solid wall is a 30 to 40 year life product, and it takes over 25 years in many cases to pay for itself through the savings. So We are, in a sense, creating an exception to the golden rule for solid wall. It does pay for itself, but not within time. And I'll come on to some of the discussion about why that's different from some of the other measures that also don't pay for themselves, and why we're not treating those in a similar way. Okay, so what's the mix? This chart is not really to scale, but it gives you a bit of a sense of how an obligation on energy companies to support measures will work alongside Green Deal and makes Green Deal work more effectively. On the left-hand side, the darker colour, that's Green Deal alone, measures that can fully pay for themselves through the saving that they create. Things like cavity walls certainly are in that category. In the middle there, you've got those things that need some self-financing, as it were, through the Green Deal charge, but also a level of subsidy driven by an obligation on the energy companies. And on the right-hand side, you've got an area where it is subsidy alone, where it will never pay for itself. And included in that, we've got heating measures as a follow-up to Warm Front. Ministers have asked us to look at covering off the installation of heating measures for the most vulnerable households as a part of what ECO does. And clearly that doesn't cut carbon, and that takes us away from where we've been before. So that is a change that we've introduced with the legislation. Okay, so what's the basic Green Deal process? Well, it always has these 4 steps if you go through with the full process. The customer journeys will inevitably be much more complicated. It will differ depending on the model and the household tenure type. But fundamentally, it should have these 4 main parts. I'll come on to talk about the assessment in a bit more detail. But one area I wanted to focus on before we moved on is what are eligible measures? In terms of the work I do, I get more questions than anything else on what is a Green Deal measure. The reality is there is no simple answer to that question, because the Green Deal will do what is right for the assessed property. It will look at what's there already, it will say where energy efficiency savings can be made, and it will recommend those products that could achieve that saving. It won't recommend it if it's not relevant. This is a pick from list that the assessment will actually relate to. Now, what you might spot from this are some of the basics, or relative basics, like cavity wall insulation, floor insulation. Well, it's not desperately basic, but some basic insulations, but also some issues that may seem controversial. So it's got photovoltaics, micro CHP, windows or glazing. So it's got quite a long list there, but how many of those really pay for themselves? Well, in some circumstances they may well pay for themselves off gas grid, but in lots of circumstances they won't. And what the intention is, very broadly, is to have, to some degree, subsidy for microgen through measures like RHI and FITs until they become more competitive in terms of cost. And then Green Deal is future-proof to be able to cover those. So in the future, when they start to replace gas boilers, if they create a significant saving, that can be Green Deal. Things like glazing, things like boilers, in many cases will only be part subsidised by the Green Deal finance. So let's say, for example, a £2,000+ boiler, if that only saves £1,000 on the previous efficiency of your boiler, you could put £1,000 on Green Deal finance and pay £1,000 up front. It's an option for some households. They may not wish to do it. Okay, for those of you that know a little bit about the EPC, you probably don't have the best perception of it. We've looked very carefully at the assessment framework. We think there are too many assessors that don't give the most accurate assessment that it's done a bit quick and dirty in many cases.